The ballroom at Harwick House was not yet full when Eleanor Hartley understood, with the clarity of something long suspected finally confirmed, that the Duke of Ashmore was crossing the room toward her. Not toward the door. Not toward the table where the punch bowl sweated in the spring warmth. Toward her, specifically, through the ranked and glittering company of London's finest spring season, past the dowager's chair and the clutch of debutantes in their whites, with the steady, unhurried purpose of a man who had already decided and was only now making the decision visible to the room. She had been standing near the window with her back to the candles, which was where a lady's companion stood when the room was full of people who did not require her company. Lady Osgood had gone to speak with an old friend 20 minutes since, and Eleanor had remained, her pale green gown unremarkable among so many more expensive fabrics, her gloved hands folded, her face arranged in the expression she had perfected over 7 months of the season's careful machinery, the expression that asked for nothing and expected nothing and gave no one occasion to remark on her one way or the other. She would understand later, going over the evening in detail as she lay awake in the small room off Lady Osgood's parlor, that she had held that expression all the way until he stopped in front of her. And then she had not. But the story did not begin at Lady Harwick's assembly. The story began 3 months earlier, on the first night of the season proper, when a woman in diamonds had looked at Eleanor across a ballroom and said, quietly and without particular cruelty, the words that would serve as the season's first judgment. Eleanor had come to London in the last days of February, accompanying Lady Osgood in the carriage that smelled of camphor and old velvet, with a single trunk of clothes and a letter in her stays that she had read so many times the fold lines had gone soft. The letter was from a Mr. Alderton, who held a note against the lease on the rooms in Bath, where her brother Silas lived and worked under their mother's care. Silas was 17. He had a position promised to him in a counting house, contingent on a character reference that Mr. Alderton, as it happened, controlled through his connection to the firm's senior partner. The note against the lease was £4,000. Their father had contracted it in the last year of his life, when the hope of recovering his fortunes had seemed, briefly, reasonable. He had not recovered them. Eleanor had read the letter's terms with the steadiness she had trained herself to maintain when reading documents whose contents would have made her mother weep. Mr. Alderton would call in the note in October if the balance was not substantially addressed. He would, in the same motion, withdraw his letter of recommendation for Silas. He had written this in a clear hand, without malice, which was somehow worse than malice would have been. She had no £4,000. She had £17 and some shillings, her wages from Lady Osgood, and the plain pale green gown she had retrimmed twice. She had come to London because Lady Osgood was the one connection she possessed to the kind of company where a woman of moderate intelligence and uncertain fortunes might, in theory, attract the attention of someone willing to address a debt in exchange for a modest, dowryless marriage. She had no illusions about what this meant. She had, instead, a very clear accounting of what Silas needed and what she was prepared to do to provide it. The first ball of the season was held at Lord and Lady Elliston's house in Grosvenor Square, and Eleanor attended it as Lady Osgood's companion, which meant she stood slightly behind Lady Osgood's left shoulder for the first hour, and was invisible to the 300 assembled guests, which suited her well enough. She was watching the room with the attention she applied to everything, cataloguing faces and family connections, and the small social transactions that determined who would speak to whom, when she became aware of a conversation happening 3 feet to her left. The Dowager Duchess of Ashmore was seated in a chair that had been placed, Eleanor suspected with intention, at a slight elevation near the column. She was perhaps 60, white-haired, wearing sapphires, and she was speaking to her companion in the composed voice of a woman accustomed to being listened to without needing to project. Her companion was Miss Cecily Pemberton, who was 20 and very fair, and whose gown cost more than Eleanor's annual wages. "She is Lady Osgood's companion," the dowager said. "A Hartley, I believe. The father left debts. She has come to fish, which is what they do." Cecily made a small sound, not quite agreement, perhaps something more cautious. She was watching Eleanor now, with polished curiosity rather than unkindness. "She is presentable enough to be dangerous," the dowager added, "and too poor to be possible. She will not get through the season." Eleanor did not move. She had learned years ago that stillness was its own armor, and she wore it now, her face unchanged, her hands loose at her sides, while the words landed and settled, and took their place alongside all the other accurate cruelties the world had delivered in the last 2 years. She would not get through the season. Perhaps the dowager was right, but Silas's letter was still warm against her ribs, and she would not be moved by a woman who had never needed to be. She did not look up to the stair. She would not know until much later that the Duke of Ashmore had been standing on the upper landing throughout, watching the room with the particular quality of stillness that was, she would come to understand, entirely characteristic of him. Christopher Erickson, Duke of Ashmore, was 32 years old and had possessed the title for 4 years, since his father's death, and he wore it the way a man wears clothing that fits him well, but that he did not choose. He was not precisely cold. He was contained, in the manner of someone who has learned that the energy required to produce warmth costs more than he currently had to spend. He had dark hair going silver at the temples before his time, a jaw that could have been cut from pale stone, and eyes that were precisely the color of the Thames in November. His mother had been managing him all season with the organized patience of someone herding a large, deliberate animal toward a gate he would eventually walk through. The gate, in Lady Dorothea's design, was Cecily Pemberton. Eleanor knew nothing of this on the night of the Elliston ball. She knew only that the season had begun, that she was beneath consideration, and that £4,000 was an enormous sum. She found out about the debt letter's specific mechanism 6 days later, when a response arrived from the solicitor she had written to in Bath. He confirmed what she had feared. Mr. Alderton's note was legal, his claim on the character reference was real, and the only realistic avenue for addressing the balance before October was a marriage settlement that included provision for the debt. She read the letter aloud to herself in the small room off Lady Osgood's parlor, because reading aloud made her absorb things that her mind might otherwise slide past in self-protection, and then she folded it and placed it in the box where she kept her correspondence and sat with her hands in her lap for a long time, listening to the street sounds outside the window, thinking about Silas. He had written to her the week prior. He was learning accounts, he said. He was good at figures. He had made a friend at the firm, a junior clerk named Thomas, and they had been to see a play. He signed his letter with 3 small drawings of mathematical symbols, which was his way of being affectionate without being sentimental, and which made her throat ache with a tenderness she had nowhere to put. She would manage this. She would find a way. That was the only plan she had. The witnessing happened in March, 6 weeks into the season, at the Ashmore townhouse on Cavendish Street, where Lady Osgood had been invited to take tea and had brought Eleanor as a matter of course. Eleanor had been sent to find a specific volume of correspondence for Lady Osgood, who was attempting to settle a small social question about an engagement from 4 years prior. The footman who escorted her had indicated the library with a gesture, and then been recalled by another member of the staff. And Eleanor had gone in alone, in the quiet, purposeful way she approached everything, and begun looking along the shelves for the volume in question. She had been there perhaps 10 minutes when she heard Mary. Mary was one of the housemaids, a girl of 18 with a red nose and a habit of plaiting her fingers together when she was frightened. Eleanor had seen her twice before, briefly, in the downstairs passages. What Eleanor heard now was a low, rapid voice, not Mary's, and then a sound that was unmistakably the sound of someone trying not to cry. She turned towards the far alcove, where the sound was coming from, and found Mary sitting on the window seat with a letter in her hands, and a footman she did not know standing over her with his hand extended. "Give it here," the footman said, "or I'll tell them downstairs you took it yourself." The letter, Eleanor understood immediately, was one Mary had been asked to deliver, and had not. It was a love letter, most likely, from the writing visible on the outside, and someone had intercepted it, or Mary had kept it, and now this man wanted it back for purposes that had nothing to do with its legitimate destination. Eleanor crossed the room before she had consciously decided to do so. "That letter," she said, "belongs to its intended recipient. Whatever arrangement you are proposing is not one I will permit to continue." The footman looked at her with the flat assessment of a man calculating how much authority a woman in a retrimmed gown could actually deploy. "I don't know you," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed, "but I know Lady Osgood, and I know this house, and I know that if you take that letter from this girl, I will report the conversation to the housekeeper before you reach the stairs." She was not certain Lady Osgood's name carried the weight she implied it did in this house. She was not certain of anything, except that Mary's knuckles were white around the letter, and that the footman had the eyes of a man who gambled on other people's fear. She met those eyes with the expression she had worn in Mr. Alderton's solicitor's office when reading the debt schedule. Not defiance, but the absolute refusal to be moved. The footman left. Mary sat trembling on the window seat, and Eleanor sat beside her, and within 10 minutes the letter had been explained. It was from Mary's young man, a groom at another house, and it contained a proposal of marriage, which Mary's employer would have used against her if the footman had succeeded in bringing it to the housekeeper's attention, for reasons that served the employer's desire to retain staff through the summer. Eleanor instructed Mary to write back honestly, to accept or decline on her own terms, and to keep the letter somewhere her employer could not find it. She had no reason to look at the library door as she left. She looked at it anyway. By some instinct she could not afterward explain, and found it empty. She thought nothing of it. She did not know until much later what had been standing in that doorway. Christopher had been there for perhaps 4 minutes. He had come to the library to retrieve a set of maps he needed for a meeting that afternoon, and he had heard voices, and his body had gone still with the quality of attention that was as natural to him as breathing. And he had watched a woman in a pale green gown talk a threatening footman out of a room using nothing but 4 quiet sentences, and the willingness to stay in the room until it was done. He had not introduced himself. He had retrieved his maps and left. He had thought about what he had seen for the rest of that day and the following one, and he had not been able to stop thinking about it, which was a condition he had not experienced in 18 months, and which he did not, at first, welcome. His first wife's name had been Catherine. She had been 23 when they married, in the summer before the war's end, and she had been gentle and kind and not very strong, and he had known she was not very strong, and he had loved her anyway, and he had wanted a child with the particular urgency of a man who has inherited a great deal and understands what inheritance requires. Catherine had given him that child in the spring of the following year. The child had not survived. Catherine had not survived the week. He had stood in the library of Ashmore Park and looked at the portrait of her until the painter's craft became simply shapes and colors, and then he had turned it to the wall because he could not destroy it, and he could not endure it. and he had told himself it was grief, which it was, and also something worse than grief, which was the conviction that he had asked more of her than she could give, and had received her death as the accounting. His mother had arranged this season's campaign with efficiency and without cruelty toward either of them. Cecily was a suitable woman. She was healthy and well-dowered, and would cause no difficulties. He had not objected, because objecting required a degree of engagement with the future that he had not yet managed to produce. Eleanor Hartley had appeared in the doorway of his attention, and he did not know what to do with it. There were 3 more occasions before the dinner that would break everything open. The first was at a small musical evening at Lady Osgood's own house, where Christopher had been persuaded to attend by his mother, who wished him to be seen appreciating Cecily's accomplishments at the pianoforte. Cecily played well. He sat in the second row and heard the music with the surface of his attention, while the rest of him tracked a woman in a gray silk gown who was standing at the back of the room and who turned a page of sheet music for Lady Osgood's elderly accompanist with so natural a care that no one in the room seemed to notice she had done it. He noticed. He asked Lady Osgood in passing, as he was leaving, how long Miss Hartley had been in her employ. Lady Osgood looked at him with the speculative brightness of a woman who has learned to read the direction of a duke's questions, and said that Eleanor had been with her since the autumn, and that she was an exceptionally capable young woman. Christopher said, without inflection, that he was sure she was. He said nothing further. He left. The second was at a garden party at the Viscount Hartfield's house in early April, where the weather held bright and cold, and where Eleanor was again attending Lady Osgood, and where Christopher found himself standing 6 feet from her near the kitchen garden wall, while a conversation about roses proceeded around them. She said nothing directly to him. He said nothing directly to her. He was acutely aware of the precise distance between them. The third occasion was the afternoon he spoke to her for the first time. He had been walking in Grosvenor Square, which he did in the mornings when the arrangements of his day pressed too close, and she had been coming around the near corner with a small basket and a brisk step, and they had nearly collided, and he had reached out one hand to steady her by reflex, and she had gone very still beneath his hand for a moment before stepping back. "Miss Hartley," he said, because he knew her name, which was information he registering. She looked up at him. She had gray eyes and a composed expression, and the particular quality of attention of someone who is very used to reading a room from a position of disadvantage. "Your Grace," she said. There was a pause of 3 or 4 seconds that occupied a considerable amount of space. "You are well?" he said, which was a formal question and meant nothing in particular. "Quite well," she said. "Thank you, Your Grace." She did not ask how he was. She did not produce a social flutter or a smile calibrated to encourage. She looked at him with the steady gray assessment of someone who was trying to determine whether the interaction required anything of her, and had not yet decided. He found, to his own considerable surprise, something almost like amusement assembling itself somewhere behind his sternum. "Good day, Miss Hartley," he said. "Good day, Your Grace," she said, and walked on. He stood in Grosvenor Square for a moment after she had gone, and then turned back toward his townhouse, aware that something in the previous 30 seconds had occurred that he would be thinking about for the rest of the morning. Lady Dorothea had been watching her son with the attention of a woman who had governed a great house for 30 years and knew the signs. She did not panic. She organized. She arranged a dinner at the Ashmore townhouse in the second week of April. A dinner of 40 guests, the cream of the season. And she placed Cecily at Christopher's right hand, and she timed the announcement for the end of the third course, when the wine had been poured, and the conversation had softened into the pleasant blur of a successful evening. She stood, her sapphires catching the candlelight, and she said, with the composed satisfaction of someone completing a plan that had been 4 months in the careful making, that she was delighted to share with their assembled friends the news of her son's engagement to Miss Cecily Pemberton. Christopher went very still. It was a stillness that was different in quality from his ordinary containment. And Eleanor, seated toward the far end of the table where companions were seated, saw the difference immediately, because she had been watching him with the quiet, accumulative attention she had been refusing to name all season. His hand, which had been resting beside his wine-glass, did not move. His face did not change. He did not contradict his mother. The room applauded. Cecily produced a lovely smile, composed and gracious, the smile of a woman who has expected this moment for several months. Several guests turned to offer their congratulations. Christopher accepted them with the automatic courtesy of a man performing a role. Eleanor looked at her plate. She did not know, in that moment, what she felt. She catalogued the feeling carefully, as she catalogued everything, and found it was not simple, and she did not have time to examine it further, because Lady Osgood was touching her elbow and speaking in a low voice about the carriage. And Eleanor stood up with the mechanical competence of someone who has long since learned to move when the body is required to move, regardless of what is happening inside it. If you are finding Eleanor's story moving even here, at its quietest and most constrained moment, then you understand already what she cannot quite bring herself to know. Stay with her a little longer. She wrote the letter that night. She sat in the small room off Lady Osgood's parlor with a single candle on the writing table, and her mother's old inkwell and the nib that she kept sharp because sharp tools were the one small luxury she permitted herself, and she wrote Christopher a letter in the clearest and most honest prose she was capable of. She told him that she was aware she had no claim on his attention, and sought to make none. She told him that if any part of the previous weeks had suggested otherwise, she was sorry for it, because the suggestion had not been intentional. She told him that she wished him well, and Cecily well, and that she would remember the season as something kinder than she had expected it to be, which was true. She did not tell him about the £4,000. She did not tell him about Silas. She asked nothing. She was very careful to ask nothing. She sealed the letter and addressed it, and put it in her box with the other correspondence, and she did not sleep. But she lay quietly in the dark, and listened to the city's night sounds, and thought about Silas, who would receive the news of her failure in October when the creditor moved and the apprenticeship dissolved, and she thought about her father, who had believed until the end that the family's circumstances would improve, and she thought about Catherine, whose portrait was turned to the wall in the Ashmore Library, and she thought about the way Christopher's hand had gone still beside his wine-glass when his mother stood up. She addressed the letter the following morning. She gave it to a footman. She felt, sending it, the specific solitary rightness of having acted from her values at the moment when acting from her values cost the most. She did not expect it to change anything. Christopher received the letter on a Thursday morning and read it in his study at the townhouse while his secretary waited in the corridor with 3 other letters requiring his signature. He read it once, quickly, and then sat back in his chair with the letter in his hands and read it again, slowly, the way he read documents that required him to understand precisely what was being said rather than what was being implied. She had asked nothing. In his experience, which was considerable, people always asked something. Even when they said they were not asking, the shape of the not asking contained the request. Eleanor's letter contained nothing of the kind. It was the most genuinely empty-handed document he had read in 4 years of managing a ducal estate and all the arrangements that the title required. It was the prose of someone who had decided, deliberately and at evident cost, to close a door she had not opened in the first place. He thought about the library doorway. He thought about the footman in the alcove. He thought about 4 sentences delivered in a composed voice to a man who had been calculating how much authority she possessed, and how she had simply refused to let him get the accounting right. He thought about Catherine. Catherine had not written him an empty-handed letter in all her life. She had been loving and generous, and she had given him everything he asked, because she was the kind of person who gave everything that was asked of her. And he had asked too much. And she was dead. Eleanor Hartley had given him, in 3 months, exactly what she judged it right to give, and had retained the rest with perfect discipline. She had shown him nothing she did not intend to show, and now she was releasing him from something he had not quite managed to tell himself he was in, and asking for nothing in return, and he was sitting in his study with the letter in his hands and the growing, clarifying, irrevocable understanding that his mother had made a very serious miscalculation. He called for Mr. Graves. His solicitor arrived within the hour, a spare and reliable man who had served the Ashmore estates for 15 years and who had the useful quality of not visibly registering surprise. Christopher gave him specific instructions. Graves listened, made 2 or 3 precise notes, asked 2 or 3 precise questions, and confirmed that the documents could be prepared within the week. Christopher told him to have them prepared within 2 days. Graves noted this without expression. "There is also the matter of a debt," Christopher said. "A creditor named Alderton, holding a note of £4,000 against a lease in Bath." Graves's pen paused a fraction. "I want it retired," Christopher said, "as part of the settlement. Confirm the current holder and arrange the transfer. The note clears with the settlement." Graves completed his note. "Understood, Your Grace. There is a young man in Bath, 17 years old, who requires a character reference for a counting-house position. The reference has been held by the creditor's connection. I want that connection untangled." Graves looked up briefly, with the composed assessment of a man who has served a great house long enough to understand when instructions have an architecture. "I will attend to it personally," he said. "Good," Christopher said. "Lady Harwick's assembly is Saturday evening." He went to the assembly on Saturday with the documents already drawn and Mr. Graves in attendance. The room at Lady Harwick's house was full and bright, 300 candles at least, the walls reflecting back the light of the season's finest assembly. Cecily was present, seated near Lady Dorothea, wearing a gown of ivory and gold that had been made, Eleanor suspected, with this occasion in mind. Lady Dorothea sat with the composed confidence of a woman who has managed an outcome successfully and is now simply waiting for the formal conclusion. Eleanor was standing near the window with her back to the candles. She had come because Lady Osgood required her presence, and she was a companion. And a companion's feelings about attending an assembly where the newly affianced Duke of Ashmore would be present were not material to the question of whether she attended. She wore the pale green gown, retrimmed for the 3rd time with a narrow ivory ribbon she had found in Lady Osgood's sewing box, and she stood in the place where companions stood, and arranged her face in the expression that asked for nothing. She saw him come in. He arrived without particular ceremony, which was to say that his arrival was simply the event it always was, the room adjusting around him the way a current adjusts around something large placed in it. He spoke to 2 people near the door. He accepted a glass. He looked across the room. He looked specifically at her. She held his gaze for exactly as long as was required to confirm that it was intentional. And then she looked away, at the window, at the cold spring darkness outside the glass, at her own faint reflection looking back at her from between the candles and the night. Then she heard the sound of the room changing. It was not a loud change, It was the particular quality of attention shifting, the way 300 people in a confined space all register the same thing at the same moment without speaking. A held breath made collective, and she turned back to see Christopher crossing the room. He was not heading for Lady Dorothea. He was not heading for Cecily. He was heading with the unhurried, absolute purpose of a man who had made a decision and was now simply making it visible toward the window where Eleanor stood with her back to the candles and her hands folded and her face in the expression that asked for nothing. She stayed still. He stopped in front of her. Lady Dorothea had risen from her chair. Eleanor could see her at the edge of her vision, the sapphires catching the light, the fan arrested at mid-height, the confidence of the previous fortnight showing its first fracture. "Miss Hartley," Christopher said. His voice was level and quiet and entirely audible in the surrounding silence. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the full weight of his attention, the November eyes, the jaw that had no give in it, and she stood inside that attention and did not flee it. Though every year of the previous season's machinery had trained her to make herself smaller, when something this large looked at her directly. "I received your letter," he said. "I know," she said. "You asked for nothing in it?" "That is correct." "I have brought Mr. Graves," he said, and something almost imperceptible shifted in his voice. "Because I intend to ask for something, and I want it witnessed." He turned his head, and Mr. Graves, who had been standing at a precisely calculated distance of 8 feet, stepped forward with the composure of a man performing a function he had been retained to perform, and inclined his head to Eleanor. "Miss Hartley," Christopher said, returning his attention to her with the finality of something long restrained and now released. "I should like you to be my wife." The room held its breath. Eleanor's held it with the room. She had thought, writing the letter, that she had accounted for every possible outcome, and closed herself against each of them with the discipline she had applied to every other painful thing the previous 2 years had delivered. She had been wrong. She had not accounted for this specific one, the one where he crossed the room in front of 40 witnesses and said it plainly, without performance, without ornament, with the same composed directness she had used in the library alcove when she told a footman that she would not permit what he was proposing to continue. She understood, in the specific way she understood things that arrived through the body before the mind had organized them, that he had heard what she had done that day. Not just observed it, heard it, in the sense of having let it mean something. "Yes," she said. Graves drew the documents from his coat. He had them in order, as was his habit, the settlement pages first. He offered them to Christopher, and then to Eleanor, with the quiet authority of a man who has spent 15 years confirming legitimacy on behalf of the Ashmore estate. And this time, he also spoke, briefly, to the room. "The settlement includes provisions for the Hartley family debt," he said, in the clear carrying voice of a solicitor accustomed to making public records. "A note of £4,000 against the Bath lease, retired in full, and the character reference for Mr. Silas Hartley, currently required for a position in a counting house, will be arranged through this office by week's end." Lady Dorothea made a sound, very quiet, that was not quite a word. Cecily had risen from her chair. She stood for a moment in her ivory and gold gown, perfectly composed. And then she sat down again, because there was nothing for her to stand for anymore. Her expression was not cruel, and it was not broken. It was the expression of a woman who has accepted the accounting and found it honest, which was, Eleanor thought, the most dignified thing Cecily Pemberton had ever done in her company. The crowd's breath came back in a murmur, not cold, not mocking, but the particular warm murmur of a room that has witnessed something it recognizes as correct, even if its source was unexpected. Several of the older women were nodding. An elderly gentleman near the door cleared his throat and said, "Hear, hear," which produced a small ripple of agreement. Near the back of the room, where the household staff's entrance gave onto the assembly floor, Eleanor caught a glimpse of a face she knew. Mary, the housemaid from the Ashmore Library, who had apparently been engaged to help with the evening's extra staffing, was watching with her hands clasped and her eyes very bright. And when Eleanor's gaze found hers, Mary pressed her lips together in the way of someone resisting an expression too large for a public room. Lady Dorothea had not sat down. She stood at the edge of the company, her fan still in her hand, the sapphires very bright, and the expression beneath them the expression of a woman conducting a rapid, private reassessment of a situation she had believed was already resolved. She looked at her son. Then she looked at Eleanor. "Your Grace," she said. And she was addressing Eleanor when she said it, which was a formal recognition that cost her something, though she produced it cleanly. She sat down. The season had its verdict, delivered in the same room and by the same social machinery that had rendered its first judgment 3 months before, in the Elliston ballroom, when a woman in sapphires had said that Eleanor Hartley would not get through the season. Ashmore Park in late spring had an avenue of limes that ran from the gatehouse to the front door for the better part of a quarter-mile. And when Eleanor arrived there in June, already the new Duchess of Ashmore, with the Hartley debt retired and Silas's letter of character dispatched to the counting-house, she stood in the lime avenue for a long time and let the smell of it, the green and alive smell of an English summer beginning, settle into her at whatever depth it chose. The wedding had been small. Lady Osgood had wept in the completely unashamed manner of an elderly woman who has decided she is owed her feelings. Silas had come up from Bath for it, taller than Eleanor remembered, wearing a new coat and pretending not to be moved, which he was. He had shaken Christopher's hand with the careful gravity of a 17-year-old performing an adult gesture for the first time, and Christopher had shaken his back with a directness that neither condescended nor required the boy to perform anything further. And Eleanor had looked at them both, and kept her own face very still. The summer was warm. The park was larger than she had imagined, and there was a kitchen garden that needed management, and a small school on the estate to which she began contributing 2 mornings a week, and a household staff of considerable size who received the new Duchess with the cautious correctness of people prepared to reserve their judgment, as was only reasonable. She explored the house by degrees, as was her way with everything. She found the library on the 3rd day. She knew about the portrait, because Christopher had told her about Catherine himself. In the sitting room of the townhouse the week before the wedding, in the specific quiet of 2 people who have decided to be honest with each other about the things that would otherwise exist as silence between them. He had told her about Catherine the way he told her everything, in short level sentences that did not ask for absolution, and she had listened in the way she listened to everything that mattered, with her whole attention and without the need to fill the space. The portrait was on the wall. It had been rehung sometime between the townhouse evening and Eleanor's arrival at Ashmore Park, which she understood was not erasure. It was something more deliberate than that, the decision that the dead could be remembered without apology and without the pretense that they had never existed. Catherine had a kind face in the portrait, gentle and not very strong, exactly as Christopher had said, and Eleanor looked at her for a moment with the straightforward respect of someone acknowledging what a room holds. Then she found the section of shelves with the natural philosophy volumes she had been hoping were there, and sat down in the window chair, and began to read. By November, the park was deep in its autumn colors, and the fires in the great house were lit each morning against the cold that came down from the north earlier that year than expected. Silas had been to visit twice, and had spent most of both visits in the library with Christopher, who had discovered that the boy had a talent for figures that exceeded ordinary counting-house work, and had begun corresponding with a friend in Edinburgh about a position of more specific application. Silas had returned to Bath after the second visit, with the expression of someone who has been given a direction to walk in, and is already walking. Lady Dorothea came in October, as she came every year when the family gathered before the season proper ended. She and Eleanor conducted their renegotiation of terms with the mutual patience of two careful women who have decided that the terms are negotiable and the foundation is not. Lady Dorothea sat in the drawing-room and managed the conversation with her customary composure, and Eleanor met her there with the same quiet directness she had always managed, and by the end of a long afternoon they had arrived at something that was not warmth, but was honest, which was, Eleanor thought, a better foundation than warmth would have been without the honesty underneath. One December evening, Eleanor came to the library late, after the household had gone quiet, to return a book she had finished, and found Christopher already there, seated beside the fire with a letter in his hands. He held it out to her without preamble. It was her letter. The one she had written the night of the dinner, in the small room with the single candle and her mother's inkwell, in the honest and empty-handed prose of someone releasing a door she had not opened. "I kept it," he said. She sat down in the chair across from him, near the fire, and looked at the letter in her own handwriting, the fold lines still sharp because it had only been read twice, once very quickly and once very slowly, and had been kept carefully in the time between. Outside the library windows, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall. It came down in the particular unhurried way of the first snowfall, when there is as yet no wind to complicate it, straight and quiet past the glass, settling on the avenue of limes and the kitchen garden wall and the roof of the small school on the estate. The firelight was warm, and the room smelled of old books and pine resin, and Christopher was watching her with the expression she had come to know as his version of the expression that asks for nothing, which was, it turned out, the one that meant the most. She folded the letter and held it. She had kept Silas's letter for the same reason. The one with the 3 small drawings of mathematical symbols. She had kept Mr. Alderton's debt schedule as well, which was not sentiment, but memory. The record of what it had cost her to remain herself through the season's long machinery. She kept things that mattered because mattering deserved to be marked. Outside, the snow went on falling. She looked at the fire, and then at the window, where the snow was white against the darkness. And she thought about the lime avenue, still and cold under its first covering, and the portrait on the wall behind her, and the school in the morning, and Silas walking toward Edinburgh with a clear direction, and Lady Osgood weeping at the wedding in the entirely unashamed manner of a woman who believed she was owed her feelings, and she thought that the season had delivered its verdict on her in the right direction. After all, quietly, in a room full of witnesses, by the man whose witnessing had always been the one that mattered. She set the letter on the arm of her chair. The snow fell past the window of the library at Ashmore Park, and it was white and steady, and did not require anything of her at all. If Eleanor's quiet season moved you, leave a word in the comments about the moment that mattered most. There are more stories here for the evenings when you need one.